Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We are going to put on our sociologist hats together and unpack a truly fascinating phenomenon: how society collectively constructs what we perceive as risk. We're stepping away from the raw data, we're putting down the hazard statistics, and we're going to look at danger through a completely different lens: the lens of culture. So I want you to think about this apparent paradox for a second, because it instantly challenges our deepest assumptions about modern rationality. The truth is, we are living longer, healthier lives than literally almost any previous generation. We've largely eradicated things like polio, yet we'll often panic over the Wi-Fi signals in our living room. Why is it that the richer and safer we become, the more intensely averse to risk we seem to be? Are we just accumulating more stuff to lose, or is something much deeper at play here? Here is our quick roadmap for the explainer today. We're going to cover 6 key areas, starting with the myth of objective risk and moving all the way through to how we can actually build resilient institutions. We're going to completely dismantle the idea of purely objective danger. And to do that, we'll be leaning heavily on a real game changer of a book. It's called Risk and Culture by Mary Douglas and Aaron WILDAVSKY. This is a seminal text, and it radically shifts our perspective. It argues that we shouldn't just be looking at scientific calculations of risk, but rather at the sociological boundaries we draw to make sense of the world around us. Let's jump into Section 1, the myth of objective risk. We usually just assume that we fear things simply because science and data explicitly tell us they are dangerous, right? We love to think that we modern folks are completely free from the superstitions of the past. We operate under this illusion that by calculating everything with advanced statistics, technological choice just sort of naturally overtakes social choice. We tell ourselves that past generations thought every disaster was some sort of political or moral punishment, while we, smart as we are, just look at nature neutrally. But actually, that's totally false. Expert and layman alike are inherently biased. Nobody has a social theory that just sits magically above the fray. Research actually shows we are pretty terrible judges of probability. When you weigh cold, objective probability against our shared social values, it's not even a contest. Shared values add immense overriding weight to what we calculate as dangerous. We almost never worry about remote objective probabilities of disaster in a vacuum. Instead, our cultural commitments are quietly editing our choices before we even consciously make them. Which brings us nicely to Section 2, how societies select dangers. Because we obviously can't look in all directions at once, we have to actively select which dangers to focus on. Think of it kind of like an investment portfolio, but for fear. The choice of risks and the choice of how to live are taken together to form this unique, socially curated risk portfolio. Every form of social life builds its own. Common values lead directly to common fears. By elevating some risks to a massive peak and depressing others completely out of sight, a society is really just protecting its preferred way of life. Let's look at a really concrete example of this from the source text. Douglas and WILDAVSKY compare the Lele people of Zaire to modern America. Now, the Lele lived in a world absolutely filled with devastating tropical illnesses. But did they focus on that? Nope. Their culture focused mainly on the dangers of lightning strikes and barrenness, which they conveniently blamed on specific immoralities or village elders. Meanwhile, modern American society fixates heavily on industrial pollution, and we blame large, faceless institutions. By holding up this mirror, we see that both societies use natural dangers to hold someone accountable and enforce the social order they prefer. This is wild when you think about it, because it perfectly highlights how dangers get selected for public concern based on the strength of a society's social criticism. Why are we absolutely terrified of asbestos, but fire doesn't mobilize us the same way? Because the tragic toll of cancer deaths from asbestos perfectly justifies a specific anti-industrial criticism. On the flip side, the very real, scientifically proven risk of skin cancer from a leisure time sunburn, well, you can't exactly mobilize a sunburn against big industry, so it gets way less public outcry. Okay, Section 3, pollution as a moral stain. Let's explore how the concept of pollution goes way beyond just physical dirt or chemicals in a river. When anthropologists study mysterious pollution across different cultures, they always run through this simple routine checklist. They ask, what is the damage, who did it, who are the victims, and how do we purify it? Answering those specific questions unwinds the causal theories of that society. It reveals an internal social problem about guilt and innocence. Most importantly, it reveals exactly who is being targeted and kept out of the group. Because ideas about pollution are actually preserving conceptual categories to uphold moral boundaries. Defilement is basically a metaphor.
It works like a giant keep out sign to threatening transgressors. When a group focuses heavily on hidden technological contamination invading the body or invading nature, they are very often using that physical danger to represent a much deeper social or moral threat. There's a quote from the text that just hits the nail on the head here. For to organize means to organize some things in and other things out. You literally cannot build a community without drawing boundaries. Elevating some risks to high alert while totally ignoring others is just part of the ongoing dialogue about how we organize our social relations.
Moving into Section 4, the illusion of voluntary choice. Let's look at the rigid boundaries we try to place around human agency. We love to neatly divide the world into two categories: voluntary and involuntary risks. We tend to think voluntary risks, like skydiving or, hey, eating questionable gas station sushi, are perfectly acceptable because the individual chose to do it. But involuntary risks, those are seen as unjust damages that require strict mitigation by law. We use this boundary to enunciate moral judgments about exactly who must be held accountable. But here is the kicker. That boundary is not given in nature. It is completely movable. It shifts entirely based on cultural standards and immense political pressures. If the cultural pattern changes, political pressure can push this boundary back until almost every single constraint on human choice is counted as an involuntary injustice. It's just a socially constructed line drawn in the sand. Section 5, hierarchies versus border groups. Now let's dive into how different structural organizations literally dictate what kinds of catastrophes keep their members awake at night. Sociologists use a framework called grid/group analysis to map this out. Group refers to the outside boundary people erect between themselves and the outside world. Grid refers to the internal rules, the social distinctions, and the delegated authority that limit how people behave toward one another. By looking at these two dimensions, you can almost perfectly predict what a specific group is going to fear the most. And the contrast here is just stark. Hierarchies, groups with strong grid and strong group, they treasure order above all else. They tremble at the slightest threat of subversion or disruption to law and order, way before an actual riot even happens. Conversely, look at sectarian border groups. These groups rely on voluntary, egalitarian principles. They have weak internal grids but strong group boundaries. They are intensely alarmed by the hidden corruption of nature. Nature in the wild is their ultimate symbol of unworldliness, so they fear technological contamination more than anything else. Finally, Section 6, building resilient institutions. So what do we actually do with all this? If risk is fundamentally a collective construct, how do we govern ourselves? First, we have to stop obsessing over raw, dubious calculations that pretend to be completely objective. Second, we must acknowledge that our risk assessments are actually deeply rooted in fundamental moral choices about the kind of society we want. And that leads us to the final step, building flexible, institutional resilience. Because, as the authors point out, since we do not know what risks we incur, our responsibility is to create resilience in our institutions. We literally cannot calculate our way to perfect safety in advance. The real existential dangers usually aren't even known until after the fact. Therefore, our true responsibility is to leave future generations with generalized resources, craft skills, institutions in good working order, and a bedrock of mutual trust. That broad resilience is so much more protective than trying to predict every possible specific disaster. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Once you truly understand that risk is a social construct, you realize that our intense debates over the environment or technology or public health, they're almost never just about the science. When we argue about what is an acceptable risk, we are really just arguing about how to organize the good life. So before we can ever agree on what to fear, we first have to answer a much bigger question. What kind of society do we actually desire to build? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this perspective changes how you read the headlines tomorrow.